Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to completely dismantle a concept that almost all of us take for granted. I'm talking about the idea that our distinct regional cultures have somehow always existed in perfectly isolated, unchanging bubbles. We often just assume that the traditions we grew up with are pristine and untouched. But as we'll see when we actually look closely at the historical evidence, a much more fascinating and messy story emerges. So I want you to think for a second about the traditional food you eat at home, or the specific clothes associated with your home state, or even the language you speak with your family. Have they really existed from time immemorial? The short answer, no way. The real answer is actually hidden in centuries of historical accidents, cross-cultural blending, and some pretty clever political maneuvering. Let's find out how. To piece together how regional culture is actually built, we are going to look at 5 key pillars today: defining regions, the evolution of language, religion as political power, heroism and the arts, and finally, architecture and social change. Let's jump right in. Starting off with our first pillar, redefining what we fundamentally mean when we talk about a region. The crucial point here is that those everyday cultural identities we just take for granted, they are actually beautiful mosaics. They're built from migration, trade, and huge political shifts over centuries. What we call a regional culture today is almost always a complex intermixing of very local traditions with sweeping ideas brought in from totally different parts of the subcontinent. Nothing is static. Absolutely nothing. Historically, if you look across the Indian subcontinent, from Kerala down south all the way up to Rajasthan and over to Bengal in the east, the frontiers separating these geographic areas were constantly evolving. The borders of the past rarely match the borders of today, which means the cultural boundaries were incredibly porous. People, ideas, and languages were just constantly on the move. Which brings us to pillar number 2, the evolution of language, and how regional tongues are heavily influenced by outside traditions. Take the 9th century, for example. The Chera kingdom of Mahodayapuram introduced early Malayalam into their official inscriptions. But fast forward to the 14th century, and texts were being written in a dazzling style called Mani Pravalam. This literally translates to diamonds and corals, and what it refers to is the deliberate synthesis of the regional language and classical Sanskrit. It wasn't an either-or situation, it was a total blending of the two. We actually see a very similar story over in the East. Early Bengali is often assumed to be purely derived from Sanskrit, but it was really shaped by ancient commercial ties and divided into 2 wonderfully distinct literary paths. On one hand, you had literature heavily indebted to Sanskrit epics and biographies. But on the other hand, you had the Nath literature. This path completely bypassed Sanskrit rules, relying instead on oral folktales, fairy tales, and songs of Mainamati that circulated right among the people. Bengali identity was forged by both of these traditions. All right, let's move on to our third pillar, how religion is used as political power. This is absolutely fascinating. In Orissa, indigenous people originally worshipped local wooden tribal deities. But in the 12th century, the Ganga dynasty ruler Anantavarman basically decided to co-opt this local devotion. He scaled it way up, building the towering, massive imperial Jagannatha temple at Puri. Later kings even proclaimed themselves the literal deputies of this god. They took a regional tribal tradition and transformed it into a massive imperial cult, all to solidify their earthly power. And this strategy? It was a total political magnet. I mean, think about it. Co-opting a local temple is a lot cheaper and way more effective than a prolonged military occupation. Whoever controlled the temple controlled the hearts of the locals. So, ironically, when the Mughals, the Marathas, and eventually the British East India Company conquered the region, they all made a beeline to control the Puri temple. It was the ultimate key to making their foreign rule acceptable to the masses. Let's shift gears to pillar number 4, heroism and the arts. In the 19th century, the British took a large part of central and northern India and dubbed it Rajputana. A distinct regional culture emerged here, and it was really cemented by specially trained minstrels. These storytellers sang highly romanticized tales of heroes who chose a valiant death over defeat. This intense culture of loyalty, valor, and extreme emotion, which even extended to widows following their husbands in death, became the absolute defining narrative of the region. And just like those heroic ideals, dance refused to stay still either. Let's look at the fascinating timeline of Kathak. It actually started out simply with a cast of storytellers in North Indian temples, known as Kathakas. From there, it absorbed the sweeping energy of the Bhakti movement, evolving into devotional folk plays called Rasalila. But it didn't stop there. It wandered straight into the opulent courts of the Mughal emperors, where it acquired incredibly intricate, distinctive styles. And finally, it somehow managed to survive absolute disapproval from British administrators to endure into the modern era. Which brings us to a really compelling question, right? Since Kathak survived that British disapproval to become a recognized classical dance after independence, we have to ask, does that label imply superiority or just a stricter set of rules? Often art forms we call folk share a ton of characteristics with classical forms. The line between a raw regional folk tradition and a polished classical art is incredibly blurry. More often than not, it really just comes down to who had the money and power to patronize the art at the time. Finally, let's hit our fifth and final pillar, architecture and social change. While money and migration literally change landscapes, starting in the 16th century, a massive eastward migration from western Bengal led to the clearing of forests for wild new settlements. People found stability in these totally unfamiliar areas through charismatic community leaders and mystics known as peers. At the exact same time, expanding Mughal control brought new mosques into the area. But the real game changer? The arrival of European trading companies. This sudden, massive economic boom deeply enriched historically lower social groups like the Kolu oil pressers and the Kansari metalworkers. And what do people do when they suddenly acquire wealth and status? They show it off. To project their new standing, these upwardly mobile groups upgraded their local deities from simple thatched huts into brilliant, permanent terracotta brick temples. But here's the cool part. Rather than inventing an entirely new architectural style, they intentionally copied the design of those local thatched huts, like the double-roofed dochala or the more complex four-roofed chauchala. This let them maintain their deep local roots while permanently upgrading the materials. They quite literally turned everyday village architecture into high-status monuments. So, as we've seen today, these seemingly rigid, ancient regional identities are actually beautifully fluid tapestries of historical intermixing. I'll leave you with this final thought. Think about your own heritage. The dances you watch, the language you speak at home, the temples you visit, they aren't isolated relics at all. They are the living, breathing results of empires colliding, trade routes opening, and ordinary people adapting over centuries. So, what outside influences actually built the traditional culture you practice today? Keep questioning the history around you, and thanks for joining me for this explainer.